As the US mulls expanding its travel ban to 36 more countries, Niger issued a stark warning. The nation says the US retaliatory action and risk losing access to strategic minerals in West Africa.
Also insulted all Africans.
We've been forgotten to be thanked. It's not a big deal. It will come with time.
There's a part that caught my attention where he was talking about ingratitude.
Ingratitude, I know this well, is a non-communicable disease to humans.
He is human. Our ingratitude is not transmissible to him. This is how this man sees Africa, sees Africans. We are not humans. In his eyes, I think that if he is not an atheist and he prays, every morning when he wakes up and prays, he should also pray for Africans. Because it is thanks to our ancestors that there is a France today. He should pray for us.
African nations have just slammed the brakes on raw exports: cobalt frozen, gold seized, cocoa contracts cut, and lithium locked inside the continent. Western markets are in panic, industries face looming shortages, and the old trade order is beginning to shake. But what exactly pushed Africa to take this bold step now? Let's break it down. Music the year 2025 will be remembered as the moment Africa stopped whispering and started shouting in the global commodities market. Until now, most restrictions on raw exports were scattered and isolated: lithium ban here, a gold policy there. But this year, those loose threads were pulled together into a visible pattern, a coordinated assertion of sovereignty for the first time in decades. Multiple African governments acted almost simultaneously to tighten their grip on raw exports. And it didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after months of rising tensions, economic pressures, and deliberate political calculations. As the Carnegie Endowment observed, the majority, 65% of imports from Africa, were raw materials and energy. That was back in 2021, but by 2025 the balance of power was shifting. The spark was lit in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the undisputed king of cobalt. In February 2025, Kinshasa announced a 4-month suspension of cobalt exports, citing an oversupplied market that had driven prices downward. But this move wasn't just about stabilizing the market, it was about flexing muscle. Cobalt is indispensable for electric vehicle batteries, and the DRC controls more than 70% of the world's reserves. When the suspension was extended to September, mining giants like Glencore were left stranded, while battery manufacturers across Europe and Asia scrambled to adjust supply chains. The message was clear: Africa would no longer let markets dominated by foreign buyers dictate the value of its resources. Almost in lockstep, Zimbabwe reminded the world of its uncompromising stance on raw materials. Back in December 2022, it passed Statutory Instrument 213, banning the export of unprocessed lithium ore. By 2025, enforcement had grown stricter, and in June the government doubled down by reaffirming its prohibition on raw chrome exports. This was not a symbolic move. Zimbabwe's lithium and chrome are vital to global critical mineral supply chains. For years, raw ore left Harare in bulk, only to be refined abroad and sold back at many times the original price. Now, by shutting that door, Zimbabwe was demanding that refineries and battery-grade plants be built on its own soil. Namibia followed the same logic, but with an even broader reach. Since June 2023, it has prohibited the export of unprocessed lithium, cobalt, manganese, graphite, and rare earths. The goal was not simply to restrict supply, but to force foreign companies, whether Chinese, European, or American, to invest in domestic processing. By 2025, that policy had moved from paper to practice, reshaping investor negotiations. Namibia's leaders made their position clear: if you want access to our minerals, you must build your smelters, concentrators, and jobs here. The wave didn't stop with minerals. In Burkina Faso, June 2025 brought the nationalization of 5 gold mines. Unlike temporary suspensions or selective bans, nationalization is irreversible. It signaled that Ouagadougou was ready to take full control of its gold sector, one of the country's biggest sources of revenue. International investors denounced the move as destabilizing, but the government framed it as liberation, a way to end decades of plunder in which foreign firms carted off gold, while Burkina Faso remained one of the world's poorest nations. Even nations not imposing outright bans seized this moment to rewrite the rules. In February 2025, Botswana renegotiated its long-standing diamond agreement with De Beers, ensuring that a larger share of sorting and cutting would take place domestically. Meanwhile, in West Africa, Côte d'Ivoire slashed forward cocoa contracts for the 2025-26 season after poor harvests, while Ghana reinforced its $400 per ton living income differential. Both moves were calculated to tilt leverage back toward producers. The pattern was unmistakable. Across minerals, metals, and agriculture, African nations were moving in unison not through a formal alliance, but through parallel decisions pointing in the same direction. Each acted for its own reasons: Congo to stabilize prices, Zimbabwe to industrialize, Burkina Faso to reclaim sovereignty, and Ghana to protect farmer incomes. Yet together, these steps exposed a continent finally prepared to weaponize its natural wealth. That brings us to the next pressing question. If Africa is making such bold moves, why risk alienating the very Western economies that have long been its biggest customers? At first glance, these restrictions look like economic self-sabotage. Why jeopardize ties with the United States, Europe, and other wealthy buyers that for decades supplied steady foreign exchange? The answer lies in a deeper calculation. African governments increasingly view dependence on raw exports as a trap, not a lifeline, and they are willing to endure short-term turbulence to break free. For years, economists warned that Africa's resource model locked it into what's often called the commodity curse. Nations rich in copper, gold, cocoa, or lithium consistently ranked among the poorest in GDP per capita. The reason is simple: the further up the value chain you go, the greater the profits. Take chocolate, a $120 billion global industry. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire together produce more than 60% of the world's cocoa beans, yet capture only a sliver of that value. Similarly, countries exporting raw lithium or cobalt see little of the massive profits when those minerals are refined into battery-grade chemicals in China, Korea, or Europe. This imbalance fostered a sense that Africa was less a trade partner than a quarry. By the 2020s, frustration had reached a boiling point. New industrial policies elsewhere, the EU's Critical Raw Materials Act of 2023 and the US Inflation Reduction Act of 2020 to only deepen the urgency. Both aim to secure minerals for Western industries while pushing friendshoring. To African leaders, this looked like a modernized form of dependency. Guaranteed access for the West, no change in terms for Africa. This context explains why the moves of 2025 were not random. They were timed, deliberate responses to a shifting global order. Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa has long argued that exporting raw minerals makes no sense if the country continues importing finished products at steep markups. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré framed gold nationalization as part of a larger sovereignty struggle, linking economic control directly to political independence. And in Namibia, leaders defended their ban on unprocessed minerals by insisting domestic processing was the only path to turning resource wealth into jobs and industries. Western critics often dismiss this as populism, but the political logic within Africa is undeniable. With nearly 60% of the population under 25, governments face immense pressure to deliver employment and opportunity. Continuing to export raw materials while importing expensive finished goods leaves leaders dangerously vulnerable. By restricting exports, they aim to force the creation of refineries, factories, and processing hubs inside Africa. In theory, this builds jobs, fosters technology transfer, and finally pushes African economies up the industrial ladder. Of course, challenging the West carries risks. Europe relies on African cobalt for EVs, uranium from Niger and Namibia for nuclear energy, and cocoa from West Africa for its food industry. The US and allies, though eager to diversify from Chinese supply chains, remain heavily dependent on African minerals. By tightening their grip, African nations know they invite retaliation tariffs, diplomatic pressure, even aid cuts. Yet here too, timing is everything. The West no longer holds a monopoly on global markets. China, India, Turkey, and Russia have all deepened trade and investment with Africa over the past decade, giving the continent alternatives if Europe or the United States decide to pull back. This multipolar world has given African leaders the confidence to risk confrontation without fear of isolation. So why provoke their biggest customers? Because Africa has concluded that the old order is unsustainable and the potential rewards of breaking it outweigh the dangers of Western backlash. For many governments, 2025 is a point of no return. Either remain locked in a colonial-style raw export system or force the world to engage on new terms. But if the logic is so strong for Africa, what does it mean for the other side of the equation? How are Western economies, long dependent on cheap African resources, coping with this sudden shift? Before diving in, a quick thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're joining a powerful cultural movement. Now, back to the story. When Africa tightened its grip on raw exports in 2025, Western economies felt the shock almost immediately. Industries that had long treated African commodities as reliable, low-cost inputs suddenly faced shortages, delays, and soaring prices. The ripple effects stretched from mining sites in Kinshasa to corporate boardrooms in Frankfurt, London, and New York. For the first time in decades, Africa's choices weren't just shaping its own path, they were unsettling the economic stability of the West. One of the first tremors hit Europe's electric vehicle sector. Already under immense pressure to meet ambitious emissions targets, automakers were blindsided by cobalt uncertainty. When the Democratic Republic of Congo extended its cobalt export suspension into September 2025,